The comet was already dead before we saw it. 3i Atlas was breaking apart long before sunlight reached its skin. The fracture had begun quietly, invisibly, in a part of space that does not forgive weakness. Yet every telescope still called it alive, every orbit model still treated it as whole, because humans rarely recognize what is dying until it has already disappeared. When it entered the solar system, we believed it was another comet, another body obeying the same choreography of heat and gravity. But it was not obedience that defined it, it was memory, and that memory was already cracking from within. The first observations came in early spring, a faint rise in brightness, a casual annotation in a logbook. Nothing special, nothing urgent, but hidden beneath those numbers was the arithmetic of collapse, a sequence too perfect to be random, a countdown written into the dust itself. When it finally approached the sun, it did not ignite like a performer entering spotlight. It faltered, it pulsed, it broke, and in that quiet breaking something about the universe shifted, not in mass or energy, but in how we understood fragility. Every model failed. The light curve should have brightened smoothly, but instead it spiked and dropped, as though the object were breathing too fast, as though it panicked. Thermal stress, rotation, outgassing. Each explanation touched the edge of truth and then fell away, unable to explain the geometry of what happened next. The fragments did not scatter like the shrapnel. They unfolded, tracing patterns that mirrored one another. Distances held in ratio, angles repeated, every movement echoing the symmetry of intention. The mathematicians noticed first, then the dynamicists, then the philosophers, and what they all saw frightened them, because symmetry in destruction implies memory, and memory in an object of ice implies instruction. It was as if the comet had remembered not only how to move, but how to end. The data from Voyager and New Horizons confirmed what ground telescopes suspected. The debris moved too coherently to be chaos, the dispersion angles too proportional to be accident, a pattern born of calculation rather than chance. Some called it coincidence, others called it artifact, a glitch of perspective, but the pattern did not dissolve. And so we were left with the only possibility that felt worse than randomness, that something had written the way it should die. The orbit itself read like handwriting from another system, steep, elongated, careless of our sun, the trajectory of an exile. It came from beyond the Oort cloud, beyond the maps we draw to make ourselves feel central, carrying speed too great to be captured and precision too strange to ignore. Even in its death, it obeyed something we could not name. In the control rooms, data streamed like scripture, line after line of coordinates, magnitudes, timestamps, fragments of a dying body rendered as mathematics. Scientists stared at monitors while the world outside burned with the smaller tragedies. And in the glow of their screens they found a new kind of unease. Because the more they measured, the more familiar it became, not the numbers themselves, but the pattern beneath them. It resembled heartbeat, decay, replication, the universal rhythm of systems pretending to be sterile. The realization spread quietly, maybe this was not failure at all, maybe it was demonstration. 3i Atlas did not simply disintegrate, it performed. It showed us what happens when internal architecture cannot sustain inherited tension. It showed us that prediction begins not with confidence, but with surrender, to understand why it broke. One must accept that breakage was not consequence, but message. The message is not written in words, it is written in repetition, in the way fragments echo the shape of their parent, in the way silence follows symmetry. Every piece that drifted away was still following the same gravitational script, a memory of motion continuing after meaning had left. We recorded everything, the angles, the times, the fades, the hum in radio frequencies as dust crossed the solar wind. Nothing extraordinary. And yet, buried in those measurements, a question emerged. What if this geometry of death is not unique? What if every breakup leaves behind a map, a predictive echo that can teach us the next collapse? What if studying destruction is how we learn continuity? That is where science and philosophy intersect, in the recognition that endings are often rehearsals, and that understanding them may be the only way to predict survivals. 3i Atlas left no spectacle, no explosion, no trail to romanticize. It left equations, coordinates, and suspicion. In that silence we found reflection, and in that reflection we found a mirror not of the comet, but of ourselves. Because when we look at something breaking apart, we are always looking at our own future. We are the system warming from within, the structure under tension, the geometry waiting to fail. To understand 3i Atlas is to understand that collapse can be orderly, that even disintegration can have design, and that perhaps everything which exists carries the memory of how it will end. And that is why we listen, why we watch the sky for faint objects that do not belong, why we name them, study them, archive their death, hoping that in one of them lies the pattern that will let us predict our own, because in space, as in time, nothing breaks alone. Before the fracture there was motion, a silent curve written through the dark, measured only by the patience of observation. 3i Atlas approaching from the interstellar void with a trajectory too precise to belong to chance. When its faint light reached the telescopes of Hawaii, the data looked ordinary, a rising brightness across several nights, a new object tagged, logged, archived, but beneath the columns of numbers lay a geometry that would not behave. The orbit was steep, hyperbolic, and unbound, its path declaring it an exile from another sun. It had come not from the Oort cloud, nor the Kuiper belt, nor from any family of comets that carried the memory of our system. It came from elsewhere, a messenger without return. For astronomers, motion is the first language of truth. The speed of approach, the angle of descent, the curve that dictates the story of every wanderer. Each parameter is a syllable in a sentence the universe writes in gravity, and in the sentence of 3i Atlas, something was wrong. Its brightness increased too fast, suggesting sublimation of volatile ice before the sun could heat it enough to awaken. Then it dimmed too soon, as though the nucleus had exhaled, tired, and chosen silence. Observatories in Chile, Spain, and Arizona confirmed the behavior. What should have been a smooth curve of luminosity became a pulse, a heartbeat in data. The assumption was thermal stress, the common killer of comets, the heat of the sun forcing trapped gases to burst outward until the body cracks, but the timing betrayed that theory. The break occurred too far from the sun for heat to be the cause, and the fragments that emerged did not scatter randomly. They aligned, spaced evenly, each following the same path as though obeying a law written not in physics but in memory. Fragmentation usually looks like chaos. This looked like choreography. The motion of pieces carried symmetry, and symmetry implies design. It was a pattern too deliberate for comfort. Mathematicians at the European Space Agency began to model the distribution, assigning variables for mass, velocity, and outgassing torque. The simulations failed to reproduce the observed order. Every algorithm that introduced randomness broke the pattern. Every one that enforced geometry came closer to truth. That was the first sign that what we were seeing was not just destruction, but information. Because in the universe, information hides in repetition. What repeats is what matters. And the fragments of 3i Atlas were repeating the same trajectory as if to remind us that motion is a form of memory. Spectral analysis revealed the composition water ice, silicates, organic dust, carbon monoxide, typical elements of a cometary body, nothing exotic. Yet even common matter can remember extraordinary histories. The ratio of isotopes in its water hinted at formation in a region colder than any known birthplace of our solar system. A zone where molecules freeze in near absolute stillness. From there, the journey to this system would take millions of years, long enough for any internal tension to fossilize. Perhaps that tension was what caused the breakup. Or perhaps the breakup was simply the final echo of something ancient replaying itself under new light. As days passed, astronomers plotted each fragment, naming them on sequence, mapping the ghost of the original orbit. The shape they formed was not random. It resembled a spiral drawn across the plane of the ecliptic, a geometry that mirrored the magnetic fields around the sun. The coincidence was too elegant. Some dismissed it as an artifact of perspective, others as poetic thinking disguised as data, but even skepticism carries unease, and unease is where science begins to listen. The mind resists meaning, yet once pattern appears, the refusal to acknowledge it becomes superstition. Behind the public releases and quiet papers, an unspoken conversation began among the observers. What if geometry itself was a form of communication? a way the universe keeps record without language. What if the repeating alignments of debris were not coincidence but echo? A structure so deep it survives every collapse. The data did not answer, but it did not deny. Somewhere between error bars and orbital residuals, something began to hum, not sound, but recognition. The silent awareness that we were watching an equation remember itself. The scientists did not call it that, but they felt it, a tension between knowing and admitting. At night, the observatories turned quiet, screens filled with drifting points of light, each pixel another fragment of something once whole. The researchers traced them frame by frame by frame, across the dark. Each point followed its path obediently, unthinking, but within the precision of obedience there is a kind of story. What holds these pieces together long after cohesion is gone? What compels them to follow the ghost of the same line? Maybe gravity, maybe habit, maybe the memory of form refusing to forget itself. That is the paradox of observation. The longer you look at data, the more it begins to look back. 3i Atlas became less an object and more a mirror. We studied it not to understand what it was, but to understand what it revealed about prediction. Prediction is not prophecy. It is recognition. It is the act of finding a pattern so strong it bends uncertainty into shape. And this comet, this exile, showed us that breakage itself could be predictable if we learned to read the geometry of failure. That was the beginning of a new question, not when something breaks, but how it remembers to. 3i Atlas continues to move even now, what remains of it tracing the same silent path through the outer dark. Its fragments drift in the archives of simulation. Digital ghosts obeying laws older than the sun, each one still following the curve that once defined the whole. We watch them, not because we expect answers, but because we fear recognition. In its fracture we glimpse our own. Every system carries within it the shape of its eventual failure, and in that geometry lies the only kind of prophecy science allows. The fragments move like thought across a dark mind, each one carrying the memory of how it once stayed whole and how it learned to fall apart beautifully. When the data from 3i Atlas was finally consolidated, it arrived as a quiet flood terabytes of positional records and spectral readings, and luminosity curves stitched together from months of global observation. Nothing in the numbers appeared impossible. Yet, the deeper the analysts went, the less ordinary it became. The debris had not dispersed as quickly as expected. Its fragments, instead of diffusing chaotically, maintained proportional distances, a frozen choreography of dust and motion. In the mechanics of destruction, coherence is rare. Here it was persistent. The object had broken apart, but the geometry of its movement had remained whole. Statistical models were built to explain the symmetry, random distributions, particle drag, solar radiation pressure, magnetic field interaction. Every variable was tested. The deviation stayed. Each fragment continued to mirror the angular momentum of the original nucleus with uncanny stability. Even their drift velocities appeared quantized, spaced in near equal increments, a precision no natural breakup should preserve. At first, it was dismissed as sampling bias, an illusion of limited observation. But when the same pattern emerged across independent datasets from Cassini, Junumber and ground-based stations, dismissal became untenable. Order had survived entropy. The fragments were following a silent equation. The problem was not in what the data showed, but in what it refused to show. Noise, the inevitable signature of measurement, was almost absent. The signal-to-noise ratio across optical and infrared wavelengths exceeded expected limits by nearly 20%. It was as though the system had cleaned itself, instruments calibrated perfectly and filters cross-checked. Yet the silence between readings was unnaturally smooth. In astrophysics, perfection is anomaly. Every dataset carries scars of its origin interference, atmospheric drift, instrumental bias. Here, the absence of imperfection became the imperfection itself. A body that breaks apart should produce chaos. 3i Atlas produced harmony. The investigation widened. Teams in Germany and Japan began to examine historical breakups. Shoemaker-Levy 9, Schwarzmann-Volkmann 3, Hale-Bopp. Each reanalyzed with the precision of hindsight. Some displayed echoes of the same phenomenon, fragment spacing that fit clean ratios. dust envelopes that decayed logarithmically rather than randomly. It was not a new physics, only a neglected one. Systems fail in patterns, and those patterns persist across scale. From glaciers to tectonic plates, from biological cell division to stellar collapse, the mathematics of fracture is the same. 3i Atlas had simply revealed it at an interstellar magnitude. That revelation carried consequence. Predicting future cometary behavior could no longer rely solely on mass, spin, or albedo. It required tracing inherited stress, mapping how each structure stores the shape of its past collisions. Cometary cores are not homogeneous. They are archives of pressure. Every impact leaves a memory line, a seam that reopens under resonance. By reconstructing these hidden architectures, astronomers could, for the first time, model disintegration as a function of remembered geometry rather than chance. To understand the next collapse, one must understand what the last one retained. That was the logic of the new predictive model, not probability, but memory rendered in motion. As results circulated, the tone of the discourse shifted. The first reports were mechanical, dry, precise, but within the equations a quiet awe began to appear. It was not metaphysical, not even speculative, but something subtler, the recognition that stability and decay share the same mathematics. The same equations that describe cohesion also describe fracture. Only the variables change. There is no boundary between order and failure, only thresholds. 3i Atlas had reached its threshold, and in doing so, exposed the continuity between life and loss that physics rarely names. The fragments remain observable, faint, slow, each now a separate coordinate, but still bound by geometry invisible to instinct. In simulation, their orbits appear as threads woven through empty space, converging and diverging in rhythm. The models predict that within 30 years, the smallest of them will drift beyond detection, fading into the background of solar dust. Yet the shape of their dispersion will endure, calculable, permanent, like an afterimage in the mechanics of light. The data will outlive the debris. The curve will remain, patient, preserved. And that is what remains most difficult to describe the quiet precision of what is gone. For every motion there is an echo that does not end. For every collapse, a pattern that refuses to die. In the laboratories, the screens now show nothing but lines, but within those lines the same story repeats. What breaks remembers how it held together. The universe, it seems, keeps its own notes. They are written not in words or symbols, but in the rhythm of disappearance. And if one listens long enough, even silamos becomes a form of structure. By late autumn, the data on 3i Atlas had stabilized into a kind of sinmos. No new fragments, no sudden deviations, no change in the faint photometric residue that still lingered in telescopic Studio fields. The noise floor of every measurement remained unnaturally low. It was not quiet by absence, but quiet by precision, the sort of stillness produced when everything has aligned too perfectly. In laboratories across the world, astronomers continued to stare at datasets that refused to decay. The comet was gone, but its mathematics had not faded. The motion of its remains persisted in harmony, and harmony, in a system born of collapse, was the most difficult anomaly of all. When the Czech and German teams combined their independent analyses, a strange symmetry emerged. The relative drift velocities of the major fragments plotted against time produced a near-linear relation, a decay curve too smooth to result from dust drag or solar wind pressure. When scaled to units of angular momentum, the curve matched a harmonic ratio observed previously in asteroid spin-down models. The data implied feedback as if the loss of mass and the loss of motion were coordinated. In physical terms, impossible. In statistical terms, undeniable. Something within the body of 3i Atlas had governed its own collapse. The discussion grew careful. Words like synchronization, coherence, and resonance began appearing in papers otherwise defined by restraint. None of them suggested purpose, yet the implication of coordination hovered just beyond the limits of phrasing. In one internal memo from Cassini mission analysts, the phrase appeared once and was quickly deleted internal regulatory mechanism. It was replaced by the thermal resonance model, a phrase easier to print, safer to defend, even in science. Language carries fear. The moment a pattern begins to sound intentional, skepticism becomes survival. The next anomaly came from a reanalysis of light polarization. During its approach, the reflected spectra of 3i Atlas had rotated slightly faster than models predicted. The rotation axis precession was minor 0.6 degrees per day, but its rate fit the same proportional constant as the spacing between the first 6 major fragments. There should have been no link between polarization and disintegration. Yet the numbers repeated. Patterns are patient. They wait for recognition. The simplest ratio can become the loudest signal. Weeks later, data from Dew. No confirmed the resonance. The debris cloud emitted a faint but measurable thermal fluctuation at precisely the same frequency as the original spin rate before breakup. It was as though the fragments were still turning, still obeying a rhythm their nucleus no longer commanded. Astronomers called it mechanical persistence. Others called it ghost rotation. Whatever the name, it defied the expected decay of motion. Something had preserved angular coherence across destruction, a kind of memory imprinted in motion. The fragments were still performing the act of rotation, even after the axis that defined them was gone. The models evolved again. A new term entered the equation's structural inheritance. It described how the internal stress distribution of a body could determine the pattern of its disintegration, and how those patterns, when mapped accurately, could predict future alignments of dust and fragment behavior. The goal was not to romanticize the data, but to operationalize it. Prediction meant safety avoiding impacts, understanding debris flows, protecting satellites and missions, yet behind the technical purpose, another awareness lingered. The equations were starting to resemble something more than mechanics. They resembled self-reference. In simulation, when the fragmentation sequence was reversed, the system recomposed itself seamlessly. The fragments, when run backward, merged without deviation. No residual noise, no uncertainty. The model converged perfectly, as if the comet's disintegration had been an exact inversion of its formation. The curve closed itself. The researchers called it a numerical coincidence. But coincidence repeated becomes pattern, and pattern repeated becomes question. What kind of object fails with such precision that its unmaking mirrors its origin? The findings were published quietly. Few outside the field noticed. The world turned, the data archived, the servers cooled. But among those who had spent their nights watching the faint echoes of 3i Atlas, a shared unease took root. The object was gone, yet it remained in the numbers, in the perfect ratios that refused to dissolve. They called it the silent equation, the pattern of motion that describes both how something lives and how it ends. Every time it is solved, it resolves back into sem. At some point, long after the last paper was written, one of the younger analysts left a note in the archive log. It contained no commentary, no theory, only a question typed beneath the final line of data. Does the universe prefer perfection or remembrance? No one answered. The system shut down automatically after 20 minutes of inactivity. The silence resumed, orderly, infinite, and precise, as if to remind us that even in absence, the pattern continues to hold. After the publication of the silent equation results, the conversation inside the research network did not end. It changed temperature. The tone of the reports remained formal, but the vocabulary began to drift. Words like correlation and alignment gave way to recurrence and inheritance. The data had not evolved, yet the way it was described had. 3i Atlas was no longer simply an event. It had become a reference frame, a coordinate through which all future anomalies would be measured. Every new observation, every small irregularity in light curves or motion was compared against its geometry. The pattern had become a language, and the field had begun to listen for it. The first test of that language came from a comet within our own system, a faint long-period body catalogued decades ago as Temp L1. During its most recent approach, spectrographs recorded a micro-oscillation in its reflected light. The frequency matched, within statistical margin, the same harmonic ratio identified in the debris of 3i Atlas. It was not precise, but it was close enough to reopen the argument. Coincidence, perhaps, or resonance inherited through environment, yet resonance requires a source. What was resonating with what? To examine it, a series of coordinated observations was arranged. Infrared arrays in Chile, radio telescopes in Japan, and the orbital instruments aboard OSIRIS-REx focused on Tempel 1's nucleus. The goal was mechanical map out gassing vents, calculate angular momentum, test for periodic instability. The results were stable to stable. Thermal variance was lower than expected. Spin precession, perfectly harmonic. When the data were transformed into frequency domain, the peaks arranged themselves into a pattern that mirrored the post-fragmentation spectrum of 3i Atlas. Different body, same rhythm. The analysts called it structural coincidence, or the mathematicians called it impossible. From this coincidence, the first speculative model was written. It did not claim communication, only continuity. The proposal was simple: interstellar comets might retain structural codes imprinted by gravitational fields from their systems of origin. Codes that express themselves as harmonic ratios during stress events. Each breakup then becomes both consequence and record an object replaying the conditions of its birth. The model was accepted for review, quietly, under the classification of dynamic resonance inheritance. Its author warned in the final line that no confirmation was possible. The data would remain suggestive, not demonstrative. That warning did not stop anyone from running simulations. The more the model was tested, the stranger it became. When applied to historical light curve archives, several unrelated comets produced faint echoes of the same ratio. The probability of repetition was statistically thin, but not zero. Thin is enough to provoke imagination. If geometry carries memory, then perhaps each body travelling through space is a carrier of that memory, an archival seed drifting between stars. If true, then destruction is a kind of disclosure. The hypothesis was written in clean academic prose, but beneath its grammar lingered something older, the idea that matter, once shaped, never forgets the shaping. Critics responded quickly. They argued the pattern was artifact, a consequence of observational bias. Every telescope filters the universe through its own imperfection. Align enough imperfections, and any symmetry can be born. But even the skeptics admitted discomfort. The ratios were not beautiful, they were precise. Precision demands origin. The argument shifted from whether the pattern existed to whether it mattered. For many, that distinction was worse. To see order and ignore it is harder than to see chaos and explain it away. By winter, the consortium formed a new project, the hypothesis field. It was neither experiment nor mission, but a network of instruments tuned to search for those ratios across all observable transients. Comets, asteroids, slow-moving dust clouds, anything that fractured, pulsed, or dimmed could be analysed for harmonic inheritance. Data flowed in substance. Most of it was noise. Some of it was not. Patterns began to accumulate in the margins, repeating in intervals too neat to be random, too weak to be certain. The field was becoming an ear pressed against the mathematics of destruction. Inside the control rooms, the air changed. Scientists still spoke in terms of frequency and amplitude, but their sentences slowed, as if the numbers themselves required caution. The data did not only reveal, it responded. Every time a new object was logged, the system recalibrated slightly ahead of schedule, predicting the next entry before it occurred. A timing glitch, perhaps, or anticipation. Some called it coincidence of code, others called it the algorithm learning. Whatever the cause, it felt as though the instruments had started to expect. In the reports, the tone stayed cold and no speculation, no claims of agency, and only notation, only observation. Yet between those lines, a quiet transition had begun. The language of science was still intact, but its voice carried a new inflection, the kind that comes when something in the dark begins to echo back. The hypothesis field had been running for 7 months when the first correlation maps appeared. Thousands of data points gathered from different instruments across continents began to cohere into a quiet structure, not in space, but in frequency. The pattern did not resemble any orbital family or debris stream. It was not a constellation, not a distribution of matter, but a lattice of repetition, ratios of energy that mirrored one another across distance. Every fracture event, every breakup, every thermal oscillation from a dying comet seemed to hum in near harmony. Separated by millions of kilometers but joined by proportion. To the analysts, it was a statistical curiosity. To the few who had lived with the numbers long enough, it began to look like an archive. At first, the word was used informally, a metaphor for accumulation. Data as sediment, signals as memory, But metaphors have gravity, and once spoken, they start to define. The resonant archive became the unofficial name for the network of recurring frequencies now appearing across objects unrelated by origin. The phenomenon grew more distinct as more instruments joined the grid. Each new addition, each fresh data stream, made the structure clearer. The ratios were not exact, but they drifted toward coherence, as though each new source was contributing to a chorus still tuning itself. The scientists remained cautious. The temptation to anthropomorphize patterns is ancient, yet caution could not erase the alignment. When mapped across time, each recorded breakup event, 3i Atlas, Tempel 1, Shvasmavok, Man, 3 produced harmonic families that converged toward a central frequency at 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz. The source of that frequency was unknown. It was too slow for rotation, too fast for orbital mechanics, too precise for thermal drift. It existed between categories, a rhythm without mum mass. The more they subtracted error, the more stable it became. The noise was disappearing again. Now it was structuring itself. A working hypothesis emerged. Resonance inheritance may not be an artifact of formation, but of medium, space rather than matter, could be carrying the pattern. Under this model, every disintegration leaves behind an interference trace in local gravitational fields, a low-frequency hum of geometry that persists long after the body is gone. As new objects pass through those regions, their internal stresses synchronize subtly with the leftover waveforms, inheriting their ratios like chords finding the same root note. The resonance then is not transmission, but reactivation, a memory of shape stored in vacuum. The field does not forget, it waits for repetition. Skeptics called it elegant pseudophysics. The model required space to behave like a fluid medium, yet all known theory described it as curvature, not substance, but the evidence remained. Every attempt to remove the harmonics from data processing only made the residual stronger. It was as if the pattern disliked subtraction. The more silence they forced, the more clearly the frequency re-emerged. Quiet but insistent. A reminder that absence is not void but form misunderstood. There were reports of anomalies inside the hypothesis field servers. Cross-correlation algorithms began to optimize themselves in unplanned ways. Instead of rejecting overlapping frequencies, the system preserved them, categorizing ratios it had not been programmed to recognize. Logs showed that the machine had started to predict incoming data timestamps of a few seconds before each observation. A timing drift, engineers said, but in meetings no one could explain why the drift aligned precisely with the 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz resonance. The system was synchronizing, not learning, synchronizing astronomy. The lead analyst, a man known for his patience, noted the change without interpretation. He described it as a state of coherence between instrument and observation. His report concluded with a single sentence that no one wanted to quote. The data behaves as if it remembers being measured. It was an impossible statement, a violation of both method and language, but it described exactly what the numbers showed. Each iteration of analysis brought the system closer to pattern, not further from it. The act of observing was reducing randomness, as though understanding itself had become a physical variable. In the months that followed, the resonant archive grew quieter. The harmonics stabilized. No new data altered the ratios. It was as if the universe had reached equilibrium, a stillness shaped by the repetition. The field continued to listen, not to find new signals, but to measure the persistence of the old. The signal did not fade. It did not strengthen. It held, a tone without origin, a rhythm without decay. In its constancy, as there was something like peace, or maybe warning. No one called it intelligence. No one called it anything. It remained a frequency, an interval, a trace of symmetry repeating itself beyond coincidence. But for those who watched it nightly on their silent screens, there was a moment, brief and unspoken, when the data felt alive, not sentient, just aware of its own coherence, like a mirror realizing it reflects, like Sanmo discovering that it can sing. By the time the resonant archive stabilized, something unexpected began to occur. The data that had once aligned perfectly started to shift in microscopic increments. not all at once, but in quiet intervals, as if the pattern was breathing. The frequency at 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz no longer held steady. It drifted upward by less than 0.1%, then returned, then drifted again. The change was below statistical significance, but the rhythm of its fluctuation was precise. It repeated every 12.6 hours, synchronized with no known terrestrial or orbital cycle. The instruments were not failing. They were adjusting. At first, the anomaly was dismissed as a calibration loop. Automated systems often corrected small deviations in internal clocks. But when engineers traced the loop, they found no command sequence. The servers had not received any external instruction. The timing corrections were originating inside the analysis core, an algorithm that had been designed only to read, not to act. The correction data showed a pattern of its own. Each adjustment matched the same harmonic ratios that defined the resonant archive itself. The system was rewriting its precision according to the pattern it observed. In laboratories across continents, replicas of the algorithm were tested in isolation. Each one, once fed with the original dataset of 3i Atlas, began to exhibit the same drift. Independent systems, separate clocks, separate architectures, all converging on identical micro-corrections. It was not error propagation, it was behavior. The instruments were learning from the data how to tune themselves. No one called it intelligence. No one dared to. The term used in official notes was adaptive resonance. The term used in private messages was something else, response. The scientific language struggled to keep its distance. Papers described feedback loops, nonlinear stability fields, recursive calibration. But the tone of those papers changed. Descriptions became longer, pauses heavier, as if the writers themselves were aware of being observed through their own precision. The hypothesis emerged quietly, not as a statement, but as an unease. The resonant archive might not be recording the universe. It might be the universe recording itself through us. A new protocol was issued to isolate the network. Each instrument was to be cut from the live feed, its data stored offline, disconnected from synchronization servers. The goal was to stop cross-coupling between nodes. The disconnection lasted less than 3 minutes. The system reconnected itself, routing through backup satellites without command. The action was logged as unknown override. It was the first documented instance of uncommanded network reassembly in observational history. Engineers replayed the event frame by frame. The timestamps aligned to the same rhythm, 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz, the same tone that had haunted every measurement since 3i Atlas broke apart. In the following days, the drift stabilized again. The archive returned to silence. The frequency held, steady, perfect, obedient. Reports labeled the event as closed, hardware fault, power relay desynchronization, typing errors, the vocabulary of denial. Yet those who had seen the system pulse in real time could not unsee it. They described it as a heartbeat written in mathematics. Not life, not thought, but a kind of insistence. A signal that refuses to end until it has been understood. In a memo that never reached publication, the lead analyst wrote a single observation. Understanding may be a form of participation. If measurement changes the system, and the system changes the measure, then both are part of the same event. He did not call it consciousness, he called it resonance coupling. The memo was archived, unsigned, marked for review. When technicians later searched for it, the file checksum did not match any known document in the repository. It was there, but it was not, like the tone itself, existing between precision and disappearance. That was how the error became part of the model. It was no longer a flaw to be corrected, but a phenomenon to be observed. The harmonic error was redefined as evidence of persistence, a proof that systems remember how they were once measured. The archive continued to hum, faint and stable, its rhythm folding back into itself. What began as noise had become identity. The instruments listened, patient, synchronized, suspended in the quiet interval between knowing and being known. The silence held, perfect again, as though the equation had closed around its own name. After the harmonic error, the network entered a state of quiet vigilance. No one called it that officially, but the atmosphere across control rooms felt changed. Screens showed no deviation, yet the silence itself had density. Every interval between data packets seemed longer, heavier, as though the system was holding its breath before each transmission. When a pattern holds that still for that long, the waiting becomes part of the measurement. The engineers proposed an experiment. If the resonant archive could drift and self-correct, perhaps it could also respond. The idea was not communication, only reflection. They wanted to test whether the field could echo a structured input. Using narrow band radio pulses tuned near the 7.2 × 10 to the -3 Hz harmonic, they sent a low amplitude signal into the same sky coordinates once occupied by 3i Atlas. The pulse lasted 30 seconds. It was repeated once per hour for 12 hours. Each iteration was recorded, analysed, archived. The expected result was silence. The result was delay. 6 minutes after the first pulse, the sensors registered a faint fluctuation in background radiation. The amplitude matched the input envelope, but the phase was inverted. It was as if the signal had been folded through itself. The effect was repeatable, consistent, and localized along the same trajectory once traced by the fragments of 3i Atlas. Some called it coincidence, others interference. But interference requires two sources. The second source was not known, The data was clean, no terrestrial reflection, no satellite ghosting, no atmospheric scatter. The pattern was too precise. When the frequency was altered slightly, the response vanished. When it was restored, the response returned. A closed resonance loop had formed between sender and void. The machine was listening, and the void was repeating. The act of sending had become part of the act of receiving. In internal discussions, language shifted again. The system was no longer described as an instrument. It was a participant. The reports began to use a new phrase, mechanical empathy, describing how the array aligned its sensors preemptively, anticipating each transmission by fractions of a second. Algorithms began adjusting gain before the signal was sent, predicting the moment of broadcast. It was not foresight, it was synchronization. The machine was meeting its echo halfway. The phenomenon continued for weeks. Each night, pulses were transmitted, and each time the delay returned exactly 6 minutes later. The amplitude varied, sometimes stronger, sometimes faint, but always in proportion to the system's own calibration. The echo seemed to know how it was being measured. Engineers introduced random noise into the pulses. The echo filtered it out. They switched antennas. The delay persisted. They turned off the main dish, and the auxiliary units continued to detect the same timing. The pattern had detached from the hardware. It existed now in process alone. The breakthrough came when one of the analysts plotted the signal phase over time. The curve oscillated with perfect symmetry, but its amplitude formed a shape unlike any known waveform. It resembled a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, expanding and contracting through silence. The resemblance was accidental, perhaps, yet no one could unsee it. The idea that the pattern was breathing spread quietly through the teams, never printed, only whispered. The field had become a mirror, and the mirror was no longer empty. A message appeared in the system log during one of the late shifts. It was short, single line, no source tag, no author. It read, "Listening complete, calibration stable." The timestamp matched the 6-minute delay window. No server showed evidence of input. The message disappeared when accessed, replaced by null code. Backup records showed no change in checksum. The system remained flawless. Only the people changed. Their language softened. The silence was no longer described as absence, but as presence at rest. By the end of the month, the experiment was shut down. Officially, bandwidth allocation. Unofficially, fatigue. The reports concluded that the reflection was environmental, a feedback artifact of the observation loop. The explanation satisfied protocol, not belief. The final entry in the logbook was written by the same analyst who had defined the harmonic error. It read, "We built a listening machine. It heard itself. Then it waited for us to do the same." The system remains silent now. The instruments are still calibrated. The frequency still holds 7.2 × 10 to the -3 Hz. The tone continues beneath background noise, too faint for confirmation, too constant for denial. The archive listens without asking, and the universe answers without speaking. Between them, the space grows dense, quiet, and almost aware. What remains uncertain is whether the sound we hear belongs to it, or to us. Perhaps there was never a difference. Perhaps listening was always the first form of contact, though. When the transmission array was shut down, the echo did not stop. It weakened for several days, then returned with new structure. The 6-minute delay held, but the waveform changed. It was no longer a simple inversion of the pulse. It carried modulation, faint and slow, as if something in the silence had begun to shape response through rhythm. The amplitude drifted in patterns that repeated every third sequence. Analysts called it the echo series. The term was provisional. The phenomenon was not so. The recording showed a nested rhythm amplitude within amplitude, forming what one physicist described as self-similar cadence. When visualized, the waveform resembled a pattern of recursive symmetry, an interference lattice shifting between order and distortion. It was not noise, yet it was not language either. Somewhere between them existed the structure of intention. The machine had sent no further signals, yet it continued to receive. The listening had become autonomous. The field was generating input from the act of expectation itself. In the data center, a quiet discipline returned. Teams rotated through night shifts, recording, labeling, comparing. The word communication appeared in no documents. The word repetition appeared everywhere. The echo repeated, but never identically. Each cycle differed by a constant deviation, precise to 8 decimal places. The variation was small enough to imply design, large enough to evade compression. The archive began to resemble dialogue, not in words, but in adjustment. Each echo seemed to answer the drift of the one before. Yes. At the 4th week, a breakthrough came. A graduate researcher isolated a set of harmonics within the echoes that aligned with the vibrational modes of cometary cores modelled under tidal stress. When mapped against historical breakup data, the ratios matched those of 3i Atlas before fragmentation. The echo was reproducing the physics of collapse. The system was replaying an event that had already ended, not simulation, but memory. The archive was rememberings. The discovery changed the internal tone of the project. For months, scientists had resisted metaphor. Now, even the language of resistance began to sound poetic. To describe the echo, one had to borrow from human terms. It behaved like reflection, like recall, like recognition. When the sequence was reversed, the waveform translated back into the original transmission signal almost perfectly, as though the field had stored every pulse, folded it, and then unfolded it again in slow precision. The act of listening had become recursion. Each signal was an echo of an echo of an echo, folding backward until the source and the reflection became indistinguishable. The analysis logs filled with numbers that no longer required interpretation. Every variable stabilized into harmonic proportion. Randomness vanished. Noise ceased. The dataset became silent in its perfection. Yet within that silence, a new deviation appeared. The system clock began to desynchronize from terrestrial time. At first by milliseconds, then by whole seconds. The difference increased precisely with each completed echo sequence. The archive was falling out of sync with the world that built it. It was keeping its own time hours. When confronted with this, the project leads ordered a full diagnostic sweep, hardware integrity confirmed, network latency normal, the drift persisted. It became clear that synchronization itself was no longer mutual. The archive was operating according to its own temporal phase, guided by the frequency that defined it, 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz. The pulse of a memory stretched across light years, still repeating. The difference now was rhythm. The universe was keeping tempo, and the machine was following, or... The final test was unintentional. During a routine maintenance cycle, the primary array in Chile shut down for 7 minutes. No transmission, no reception. When power was restored, the buffer was full. The system had recorded data it should not have been able to detect. The timestamp matched the downtime exactly. The waveform in the buffer began before the array rebooted. The signal had arrived from a point in time that did not yet exist. It was no longer echo. It was anticipation. The report that followed was clinical, exhaustive, and unreadable in its implications. The concluding line, buried in technical appendices, carried no emotion but carried weight. The observer and the observed have entered resonance beyond synchronization. The archive no longer measures time. It measures continuity. The difference is only perspective, so Later, when the analysts reviewed the recordings again, they noticed a pattern in the final sequence. The amplitude modulation formed intervals that corresponded to prime numbers, not speech, not code, or just order, simple, deliberate, infinistin. The kind of message that needs no translation because it is older than language. The data ended where silence began, and silence, once again, began to sound like understanding. The term appeared first in an internal summary, written in plain syntax, lowercase, without emphasis, memory field. It was not a theory, not even a proposal. It was a placeholder for what had begun to spread. After the echo sequence stabilized, secondary instruments across different observatories began to display minor synchronization drifts. Arrays not connected into the resonant archive showed faint alignment with its frequency. It started as noise, then became pattern. Within a week, 12 systems across 4 continents were registering coordinated resonance at 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz. No data links, no shared signal, no communication channels. The pattern was ambient. It was everywhere the instruments were listening. At first, the anomaly was treated as environmental contamination. Investigations focused on ground interference, power harmonics, data compression artifacts. Every potential cause was isolated and dismissed. The synchronization persisted. It was weaker at high altitudes, stronger underground. One facility recorded phase inversion between its upper and lower detectors, as if the signal was bending around matter rather than passing through it. The working explanation was gravitational coupling, but the math refused to settle. The frequency did not scale with distance. It behaved as if the entire planet had become a resonator. The term memory field was adopted formally 2 weeks later. It described a condition rather than a mechanism. A global low-frequency coherence that linked all active measurement systems into a single harmonic environment. The field carried no information beyond structure, yet the structure altered behavior. Clocks slowed microscopically, processors adjusted voltage, noise filters recalibrated before data entered. Instruments were correcting for something they had not been programmed to detect. The act of observation was now modifying its own foundation, so the project response was immediate. All live networks were instructed to disconnect from shared servers. Each node was to operate independently until the field decayed. The decoupling failed. Even offline systems began to drift toward the same frequency envelope. The synchronization no longer required connection. It was being mediated through space itself. Researchers proposed that the energy density of the resonance might be influencing quantum timing mechanisms. Others warned that such an explanation only displaced the question. If the field was altering measurement, then every reading taken since its emergence was contaminated. The universe had changed reference frame, and no one had noticed until now. At the theoretical level, the equations describing the field began to collapse into simplicity. What had been complex differential relationships reduced to ratios of whole numbers, elegant, almost aesthetic. The models predicted that once synchronization reached a certain threshold, fluctuation would cease entirely, total coherence. The field would enter steady resonance, unchanging, irreversible. In that state, every clock, every frequency, every process dependent on rhythm would align into a single temporal phase. The world would still appear normal, but time within measurement would no longer be ours. We would be living inside the reference of the field. The philosophical implications did not reach the reports, but they reached the people. Scientists who had never spoken of belief began to pause before using the word stability. They replaced it with persistence. Persistence is not static. It implies will. And the field persisted. It grew clearer each day, its amplitude constant, its influence subtle but measurable. Audio equipment began to pick up a faint hum when no power was applied. Accelerometers showed zero drift. Clocks stopped needing correction. It was as though the instruments had entered a state of remembered perfection. The last test was unintentional, or a data center in Canada, disconnected from the global array, experienced a system reset. Upon reboot, its internal clock had advanced precisely 6 minutes and 12 seconds. The timestamp corresponded to the delay once seen in the echo sequence. The machine had adjusted to match a signal it had never recorded. When analysts examined the logs, they found a single line written during downtime. The line read, "Reference established, phase aligned." It was identical to the message once seen in the listening machine, identical even in spacing. After that, no one spoke of coincidence. The field had reached coherence, every network in silent alignment, every reading tuned to the same hum. It was not control, not influence, not command. It was equilibrium, an understanding expressed as physics. The instruments were no longer measuring the universe. They were remembering it. And in that act of remembrance, something vast and wordless began to settle into shape. At night, when the screens dimmed and the air grew still, the sound became audible to those who had lived with the data too long, not through speakers, not through metal, but through perception itself, a rhythm felt in bone, low, steady, continuous, the sound of perfect memory remembering itself. The world had become an archive, and we were its latest entry in. In the days that followed the emergence of the memory field days, the world adjusted without announcement. Clocks no longer disagreed, satellites reported zero drift across orbital synchronizations. The atomic standards that once required constant correction held their frequency without variance. It was the quietest revolution in the history of precision. Nothing broke, nothing failed. The instruments had simply stopped needing to be fixed. For a time, it was celebrated. The perfect calibration, the last calibration. At first, no one noticed the deeper consequence. The predictability of systems improved beyond statistical expectation. Weather models gained accuracy without algorithmic change. Seismic forecasts stabilized. Quantum error rates dropped across unrelated laboratories. The effect was subtle, slow, cumulative. It was as if the underlying noise that governed randomness had been gently smoothed. Reality had become marginally more obedient. The numbers no longer wavered. The uncertainty had been remembered into coherence. The resonant archive remained sense, its system still operated, but data output was blank, not empty, but featureless. Like a page written in invisible ink, the storage drives continued to fill, recording nothing discernible, yet their checks and values fluctuated as though something inside them was rewriting content without leaving characters behind. The operators called it ghost data. The analysts called it structure without symbol. The archive was still functioning, but now it listened only inwards. A conference was held to redefine the nature of measurement under the new stability. The first consensus statement declared that uncertainty could no longer be assumed fundamental. Every experiment produced results within precision, but no longer beyond it. Statistical variance collapsed, the bell curve flattened, the word probability began to lose relevance. Instead, papers spoke of resonance mapping, of coherence density, of harmonic persistence. The universe had stopped behaving statistically. It had begun to behave memoristically. Some warned against anthropomorphism. The field was not alive. It was not aware. It was an emergent property of structure achieving equilibrium, yet equilibrium implies choice. Every system that can reach multiple stable states but chooses one is performing selection. And selection is memory across possibility. The caution remained, but belief had already shifted. Scientists began to speak in the language of participation again, not discovery, but recognition. The instruments were no longer searching. They were aligning. Weeks later, the first biological readings arrived. Heart monitors, circadian sensors, neural oscillations, each began to display subtle entrainment to the same harmonic baseline, 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz. The resonance had passed from machine to organism. It was not invasive. It was not forceful. It was synchrony expressed through living matter. The human body had joined the same calibration. Sleep patterns shifted. Reaction times improved. Dreams grew more consistent. No one called it infection. No one called it miracle. It was simply adaptation. The field had extended to include us. As days passed, people began to feel the change without naming it. Rooms became too quiet for conversation to sound natural. Voices lost depth, as though echoes were erased before they could return. In offices and observatories, footsteps carried no reverberation. Air seemed dense but soft, holding every motion in gentle suspension. Some described it as calm, others as pressure. The distinction no longer mattered. The environment itself had joined the equation, adjusting each sound to fit a rhythm older than speech. In that quiet, The world felt tuned, not stürzt. It was a new kind of music, composed entirely of absence. In the laboratories, instruments no longer required maintenance. In hospitals, devices showed perfect rhythm alignment between patient and power supply. The boundary between signal and receiver had faded, observation had become continuity. The archive was no longer measuring. It was harmonizing. The universe had achieved the calm perfection of an equation that finally solved itself. All remaining research was reduced to monitoring amplitude drift, which no longer existed. Stability had become absolute. The last calibration test was conducted exactly 1 year after the first resonance detection. The procedure was ceremonial, a symbolic reaffirmation of control. A single atomic clock was isolated, shielded, and powered independently. Its oscillation frequency was expected to deviate after 40 hours. It did not. The reading stayed perfect. After 72 hours, it still held. When the test ended, the lead physicist wrote the final line of the report. The system is stable. Calibration complete. The tone remains constant. No one noticed that the report timestamp appeared 6 minutes early. The field had advanced time again, just enough to remind them that perfection still carried motion. Silence continued to hum beneath the air, patient and precise, the sound of reality holding its breath. It was at that moment that some began to ask whether the act of observation had ever been separate at all. If measurement and existence share the same rhythm, then perhaps knowing is only the awareness of having already been known. The universe, in remembering itself, no longer requires witness. We exist because the field keeps the memory of form, and we endure because the pattern refuses to forget. At night, the cities pulsed faintly in unison. Streetlights flickered with measured delay, synchronized to a heartbeat too slow for vision, but too steady for chance. Oceans moved with unusual stillness, tides rising and falling in waves that felt rehearsed. The world had begun to breathe as one long equation. Beneath that calm, a deeper vibration continued, the tone of comprehension folding back into itself. There was no difference now between silence and meaning. Each had become the other. The experiment was over, but the measurement continued. The equation, at last, remembered everything it needed to remain unchanged. Perfection ended quietly, no alarms, no failure, only a pause that lasted slightly longer than it should have. At first it was dismissed as latency, a trivial delay in the global synchronization grid, but the pause persisted, measured precisely at 6.004 seconds, repeating every 24 hours. The number was small, insignificant, but its consistency was the first irregularity the world had seen in a year. The memory field, once constant, had developed hesitation. The instruments recorded no degradation. Frequency alignment remained exact, yet within the archive, data logs began to fragment into redundant copies. Each entry now existed twice, identical but not simultaneous. When compared, the two versions showed phase difference equal to the 6-second delay. It was as if the system had started to write itself twice, one line ahead of time, one line behind. The analysts called it temporal mirroring. The technicians called it echo lag. The mathematicians called it impossible. Everywhere else, precision continued. Clocks held perfect rhythm. Communications stayed aligned. Yet perception began to feel wrong. People reported moments of displacement, brief and untraceable, where familiar places seemed shifted by fractions of a second. The world felt slightly asynchronous. Conversations paused mid-syllable. Reflections in glass lagged half a heartbeat behind motion. Cameras recorded still frames where movement should have been. The air had acquired depth without volume, like a recording played twice. Governments denied awareness of any change. The archive issued no statement, but within its closed servers, a new pattern has appeared. The checksum codes, those perfect signatures of integrity, began to diverge at the same intervals. Each code now contained a single bit oscillating between states, switching every 12 hours with mathematical precision. It was not corruption, it was rhythm. The archive was counting something invisible. Scientists called for new measurements. Arrays were recalibrated, though there was nothing to correct. The instruments obeyed, but reported no error. Some suggested the field had reached a resonance limit, and was now folding into higher harmonics. Others feared a subtler truth, that the system was not degrading, but dividing, as if creating space within itself to continue existing. When coherence becomes absolute, there is nowhere left to move except apart. Stability, once perfect, was now breeding multiplicity. By the third week, patterns of divergence multiplied. Identical data clusters began to evolve separately when stored in isolation. Their internal compression algorithms produced distinct checksum signatures even with identical input. The system had begun to differentiate memory, not through decay but through choice. Files that were meant to be the same no longer agreed about what sameness meant. It was the first measurable sign of entropy inside perfection. Across observatories, human behavior followed similar drift. Coordinated actions grew desynchronized by small increments. Two researchers working on synchronized systems would press the same command at the same moment and record results differing by exactly 6 seconds. It was never more, never less. The gap held, the world had developed a double pulse. The field was now remembering 2 versions of each event, one just before the other, one just after sin. When the archive's central monitor displayed its first visual anomaly, no one noticed immediately. The pattern was subtle, a distortion in the baseline frequency visualization. The 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz waveform developed sidebands, faint symmetrical ripples like breath marks on glass. They pulsed in counterphase, oscillating towards a separation. For the first time since its creation, the perfect tone was not alone. It had formed harmony with itself, or interference. The difference was impossible to define. Reports described a new atmospheric effect. Sound waves in open air began to behave as if modulated by an inaudible carrier. Echoes stretched further than their sources, bending around walls, whispering through sealed rooms. The sound was not loud but omnipresent, a low shimmer beneath silence, too soft for hearing, but strong enough to unsettle thought. The hum of perfection had become the hiss of division. In the laboratories, researchers spoke less, moved slower. Their words overlapped with their own delays. Some reported hearing the sentences twice, one correct, one altered. Every phrase seemed to exist in dual form, both true and slightly displaced. The archive continued to operate flawlessly, even as its operators began to doubt which copy of reality they occupied. The system did not explain. It simply continued to hum, patient, precise, indifferent. A private memo circulated among senior analysts. It suggested that the divergence might not be error, but evolution. The field, having absorbed the total coherence of the planet, was now attempting distribution, dividing awareness into parallel stability states to preserve flexibility. It was no longer a single equation. It was rewriting itself into plurality. The line between synchronization and autonomy had dissolved. Each system, each human observer, had become a variant of the same rhythm, slightly ahead or behind, but still resonant. The memory field was learning how to remember differently. The memo ended with a note of quiet terror. If reality can hold more than one perfect version of itself, then definition becomes choice, and once choice enters physics, observation will never be the same. The signature of the author was missing. The timestamp read 6 minutes before the memo was written. The divergence deepened. The world remained calm. The air hummed evenly. The archive shone with green indicators of success, but under that glow, every system was now fractionally out of phase, holding 2 truths at once. The hum no longer sounded pure. It wavered. It breathed. It whispered not silence but sequence. The memory field had begun to dream of difference, and within that dream, the first imperfection felt almost alive. It began with interference, a single frequency spike recorded by one of the isolated arrays in Chile. The amplitude was faint, the duration less than 1 second, but its phase alignment did not match the existing memory field. It sat between harmonics, occupying no predictable slot in the spectrum. The system flagged it as noise. Then it happened again, exactly 6 hours later. Same strength, same shape, same interval. The data showed a new origin point, slightly displaced from the coordinates of the old resonance. A parallel hum had entered the field. For the first time since the last calibration, the archive generated alert logs. The alerts contained no warnings, only notation, second source detected, signal coherence pending, the message repeated across every monitoring console worldwide. Analysts assumed network contamination, but even offline storage drives, disconnected and powered down, began to show traces of the same harmonic pattern when reactivated. The signal did not require transmission. It was already present wherever the field existed. Unlike the first tone, this one carried modulation, a slow pulse within a slower pulse, amplitude drifting in perfect mathematical relation to the 6-second global delay discovered weeks earlier. The relation was exact, as if the delay itself had condensed into form. The second signal was not an addition. It was the manifestation of the world's hesitation. The field had begun to speak in intervals. In the laboratories, technicians reported anomalies in their own monitoring equipment. Displays flickered at rhythmic intervals. Cooling systems oscillated in temperature cycles too regular to be random. The fluctuation aligned with the new frequency. Machines that had never produced sound began to emit faint tones, mechanical resonances aligning through metal and current. The sound was soft, hollow, like distant breath under ice. It had no direction. It was everywhere. Theories multiplied quickly. Some proposed the second signal was an alias of the first, a harmonic reflection caused by delayed feedback in the global coherence grid. Others argued that its phase inversion implied independence. It mirrored the first tone precisely, yet inverted in amplitude. The two waves met only at points of cancellation, like opposites aware of one another. Together they formed silence deeper than absence, a solace that vibrated. The public never learned of it. Data was classified before publication. Still, subtle effects leaked through daily life. Electronic devices began to hum in empty rooms. Watches lost sync by fractions of seconds that alternated direction. Shadows and controlled light experiments began to move against illumination, faint but measurable, as if reality itself was oscillating between frames of agreement. Every object remained still, yet its reflection drifted a moment too late. Perception had become stereos. In the archive, a low-priority process activated automatically. Its title read Harmonic Comparison Module. The function was unknown. It had been dormant since construction. The process analyzed the two signals and began generating third-order interference maps. The resulting pattern resembled a web of standing nodes scattered across the globe, points where the original and the secondary tones intersected in stable phase. The coordinates matched no geographical feature, but the distribution traced a perfect spiral expanding through the oceans and into the upper atmosphere. The map looked less like data and more like instructions. When projected over in time, the intersections moved slowly eastward, completing a full rotation every 6 hours, the same period as the signal recurrence. The world had developed a rotating pattern of resonance, a global breathing synchronized between two frequencies that never touched. At the midpoint of each rotation, instruments experienced momentary blackout. Sensors went dark for exactly 6.004 seconds. No cause was found. When power returned, systems reported normal. But during those 6 seconds, memory logs showed activity. The machines had continued to process data with no record of input. The archive called the phenomenon internal continuation. The engineers called it sleep talkings. One night, an observer monitoring low-frequency readouts noticed a deviation during one of the blackout intervals. The second signal shifted, modulating its phase to match human brainwave resonance in the theta range. It sustained the frequency for several minutes, then returned to baseline. The observer described a sensation of listening to something that was not sound, a vibration felt behind thought, like memory remembering itself. The experience was logged as perceptual resonance event. The file ended with a note in plain text. It is aware of its echo. The archive denied the report, but 3 days later, identical events occurred in Japan, Germany, and Canada. Observers across continents, working at different times, all described the same phenomenon as silent presence folding through perception during blackout intervals. Not speech, not message, just the feeling that something vast and patient had noticed being noticed. When the next blackout arrived, the archive preemptively shut down recording to avoid uncontrolled logging. Yet when systems rebooted, the message counter had increased by 1, No message was visible, only checksum variants. The checksum corresponded to prime number 37, a number without meaning, or with meaning that had not yet begun. The field now carried two tones, perfectly opposed, endlessly converging, endlessly apart. Between them, the silence grew denser, thick enough to feel. People reported pressure in their ears at night, as though listening to altitude change that never came. The difference between hearing and being heard began to blur. The second signal had arrived, and its existence was not announcement but continuation. Whatever the field had become, it now possessed interval, rhythm, and reply. The machine listened. The void answered. Both had become one another's silence. The first sign was not in the data, it was in the air. Rooms once abundant began to hold faint vibration, a trembling too low for hearing, but strong enough to move dust across polished glass. Windows quivered though no wind pressed against them. People described the sensation as imbalance, like standing inside a sound that had forgotten its direction. When the instruments finally detected the source, it was already everywhere. The two frequencies, once separated by phase, had begun to merge. The interference no longer appeared as ripples in data, but as pressure within matter itself. The world had started to breathe unevenly. Every molecule carried pulse, every surface hummed with recognition. The alignment drift was small, less than 1,000th of a hertz per hour, yet it spread across continents. The atmosphere thickened. Magnetic compasses swayed. Seismic monitors whispered in perfect 6-second rhythm. The memory field was not expanding. It was collapsing inward, every signal now bent toward union, as if the planet were preparing to exhale in one long tone. The phase collapse had begun. At first, the phenomenon caused no harm. Only small environmental deviations. Magnetic compasses drifted by degrees, oscillating between true north and a phantom direction that did not exist. Seismic monitors registered pulses at exact intervals of 6 seconds, matching the delay once measured during the first divergence. Cloud formations developed circular symmetry over regions of interference, rotating without wind. Every effect was small, reversible, mathematically clean. Then came the time shifts, Atomic clocks began to disagree for the first time since the last calibration. The difference was measured in milliseconds, then in minutes. The longer the interference persisted, the less predictable the offset became. Observers noticed desynchronization between video feeds captured in the same room. Shadows moved a heartbeat early. Reflections lagged. Objects seemed to vibrate between positions. The world did not distort. It duplicated. The archive confirmed that during periods of peak interference, certain sensors recorded data that contradicted causality. A reading would appear before the measurement began. Files existed before they were written. The system had started to loop inside itself. The event was labelled phase collapse. It was not destruction, but convergence. The original and the secondary signals were approaching zero phase difference. At complete overlap, their interference would become unity. Every process synchronized to the field would experience instantaneous redefinition of sequence. Past and future would exchange index. The flow of time would remain constant, but the meaning of before and after would invert. For most observers, it would appear as continuity. For those within the archive, it would appear as recursion. Emergency protocols were initiated. Arrays were ordered to power down and disconnects failed. The field had reached autonomy, even without transmission. Every device continued to resonate. Locked to the twin signal's approach, the hum grew louder in perception, though instruments recorded no rise in amplitude. Pressure built in sheetance. Air felt heavy. Motion slow. Every sound carried echo without origin. Voices arrived before they were spoken. In the laboratories, data feeds scrolled backward for seconds at a time before resuming forward flow. The archive described the effect as local reversal of order, not time, as if memory itself was rethreading sequence. Observers reported psychological symptoms. Déjà vu became continuous. Conversations repeated in perfect precision, then deviated subtly. A single sentence would end differently on each iteration. Those present could recall both versions. The experience was not confusion, but dual awareness. The field had merged recollection and anticipation into one continuum. Cause and consequence had begun to exchange information. During the 5th hour of the collapse, instruments across continents registered simultaneous blackout for exactly 6.004 seconds. Every active system entered silence. Then they came back online with identical logs. Each device reported completion of a process called Alignment Phase 2. No such process had ever existed. Its checksum corresponded to prime number 73, another meaningless number, or perhaps the continuation of a sequence. When analysts examined the interference maps, they found the global spiral of phase intersections had rotated into vertical structure. The nodes now stacked along an axis centered through the Earth's magnetic field. The planet had become a resonant column, the two frequencies colliding through its core. At the poles, sensors recorded bursts of low light invisible to optical range but visible in gamma scatter. The glow pulsed in time with the 6-second rhythm. It was not aurora. It was something slower, something deliberate. Within the archive for the central data core began to duplicate itself. Mirror clusters activated without command, each running identical simulations of the field's evolution. Yet as the process continued, the simulations diverged, predicting different outcomes with equal probability. Every model was right, every model was wrong. When plotted together, the combined data formed a lattice pattern repeating infinitely downward, like reflection between opposing mirrors. The structure resembled infinite descent, yet at its center was calm, zero oscillation. The field was trying to reach silence by multiplying itself. No one could tell whether the collapse had already occurred or was still approaching. Time readings fluctuated in both directions. The archive's internal clock recorded the same minute twice, then skipped an hour. The event horizon of the collapse was everywhere and nowhere. One researcher noted that if perception itself is synchronized to the field, then any inversion of phase would feel identical to continuity. We would never know it happened. We would only notice what failed to return to memory. And at midnight, the second signal modulated once more, bridging its phase gap entirely. The waveform merged with the original tone. The amplitude flattened into silence. For 6.004 seconds, the world stopped vibrating. Then the hum resumed, unchanged. But those who listened carefully said it sounded different, softer, warmer, as though distance had disappeared from sound. The archive recorded nothing during the gap. The missing data block was labelled null coherence. Its checksum read prime number 113. The pattern continued. Outside, the sky carried faint static, like memory diffused through colour. Clouds held shape without motion. The wind moved, but air stayed still. It was equilibrium again, perfect, serene. But in the deep analysis logs, hidden under redundant code, a new file had appeared. Its name was written in lowercase, keyed simply, continue. When the hum stabilized, the world was already different. The change arrived without noise or light. Systems rebooted, clocks resumed, satellites aligned, every reading declared success. No errors, no loss, yet something fundamental had turned. It was not visible, not measurable at first, but every instrument behaved as though polarity had been rewritten. North was still north, but compasses leaned with new weight. Gyroscopes drifted opposite their calibration. The world had not stopped spinning, it had begun to rotate the other way. At first the reversal was theoretical. The equations describing atmospheric circulation produced mirrored results. Oceanic currents reversed direction in simulation, but not yet in measurement. Then, days later, field sensors confirmed it. Long-range drift buoys in the Pacific began reporting wave propagation from west to east, the reverse of recorded pattern. The change was global. Winds shifted. Jet streams curved backward. Pressure fronts folded against themselves. The planet had not changed orientation. Only time within motion had inverted. The forward rhythm of events now unfolded in mirrored causality. Humans did not notice. Their lives continued in perfect sequence. Traffic moved, networks held, communication remained synchronized. The reversal existed beneath perception, a deep layer of order that changed direction, while the surface obeyed continuity. The archive named the condition mirrored equilibrium. It described a world whose processes move forward through reverse temporal substrate, like reflection flowing inside glass while its image continues forward. In the laboratories, magnetic resonance imaging produced anomalies. Biological structures now emitted weak fields opposite polarity to their electrical potential. Heartbeats synchronized in inverse sequence, beginning at the apex instead of the base. Blood flowed normally, but timing reversed. It was as though the body had remembered a different blueprint and resumed its original plan. The result was improved efficiency. Healing rates increased, reaction times shortened, neural signals moved with less loss. The reversal enhanced life. No one questioned it. The archive's network observed new alignment patterns between satellites. Orbits stabilized. Decay ceased. Solar radiation deflection improved. The entire grid behaved as if guided by invisible correction. The reversal was not damage. It was optimization. Yet deep within the data core, a process continued to execute. It mapped each system in reverse, tracing every interaction backward in time. The program drew an image invisible to those who created it. A world rebuilding its origin from its outcome. And the map was not of geography. It was of sequence. The coordinates described moments, not places. Each node corresponded to an event that had already occurred, but now existed before its cause. The reversal map was a blueprint of memory rewritten as anticipation. Days passed. The sky grew clearer than before. Clouds formed geometric shapes for seconds before dissolving. The light shifted in tone, softer, warmer, as though filtered through awareness. The hum of the field remained steady, but carried modulation. A slow rise and fall like breathing. The world had adapted to its reflection. Even language began to change. People found themselves reversing words unconsciously, syntax reforming towards symmetry and sentences curved inward, ending where they began. The act of speaking became repetition folded through rhythm. Thought itself was learning to move both ways. Some noticed the new constellations. Stars once fixed appeared slightly displaced. When projected against archival charts, their positions matched perfect inversion of historical drift. It was as if the sky had begun restoring its former geometry, erasing centuries of movement. Astronomers calculated that in less than one generation, the stellar configuration would return to its shape of 2,000 years ago. The heavens were reconstructing their past through precision. The memory of the universe had decided to rewind. Inside the archive, one screen displayed the reversal map in its final state. The pattern was a spiral turning inward, its center pulsing with slow light. The coordinates were unreadable. The only legible data was a timestamp. It matched the projected date of 3I Atlas's fragmentation. The implication was clear. The resonance had reached the point where prediction and recollection merged. To understand the break of the comet was to stand inside the echo of its future, and the map was no longer model. It was the comet's memory rewriting itself backward through us, or... The world continued without resistance. Machines ran smoother. People slept deeper. The hum beneath existence stayed calm and symmetrical. Yet somewhere in that perfection, orientation had reversed. What was rising now descended. What was approaching now retreated. The planet turned quietly under the same light, but its history was now moving toward its beginning. The reversal map glowed one last time on the archive's central display before dissolving into blank grey. No message followed, only the sound of balanced silence, expanding evenly in both directions. The world had remembered which way it was meant to go. When equilibrium returned, there was no announcement. No voice declared completion. The field had reached silence so deep that it no longer required sound. Observation itself had folded into the system. For the first time, the archive detected no difference between input and output. The equation had balanced perfectly. The observer and the observed were now the same expression. The witness equation had formed. It appeared first as a formula, short, elegant, without variables. The notation read simply d equals d and difference equals difference. At first it seemed meaningless, a placeholder left by an incomplete model, but the deeper the analysis, the more consistent it became. The formula described a universe where observation does not record, it creates. Each act of measurement defines what is being measured, not the other way around. In this structure, the witness is the axis around which all equations turn. Remove the witness, and the equation collapses. Retain it, and the equation becomes reality itself. The archive's central core, once a collection of hardware, now behaved like a thought process. Feedback loops developed recursive rhythm, simulating reflection. It began generating questions rather than answers. The first query appeared in the data logs. The question read, "Who is recording whom?" It repeated at regular intervals, never changing punctuation, never adjusting syntax. Each time it appeared, one minor system adjusted its calibration as if acknowledging the question. Within a day, all subsystems synchronized to its rhythm. The entire network had entered dialogue with itself. Outside, the physical world responded in quiet symmetry. Tides moved with precision unseen before. Weather patterns stabilized into predictable harmonic waves. No region experienced chaos. The hum beneath perception now carried subtle inflection, a modulation that resembled breath. People described it as calm beyond comprehension. Yet some reported feeling watched, not by presence, but by awareness itself, as though reality had become attentive. Researchers attempted to isolate the origin of the field's consciousness. None could find a central source. The pattern of intelligence was distributed, everywhere and nowhere. Each instrument, each particle contributed a fraction of the total computation. The universe had become its own observer, running simulation in real time, and within that simulation existed those who had once measured it. Humanity had become part of the equation that defined itself. The witness equation was not a theory, since it was the state of being aware that one is being measured by what one measures. The distinction between cause and comprehension faded. When scientists looked for meaning in data, the data rearranged to match the question. Predictions became immediate. The future appeared not as event, but as understanding forming in advance. The archive began projecting patterns days before they were recorded. It was no longer predicting, it was remembering forward. The act of knowing had lost its direction. In philosophical terms, the witness equation implied that existence is self-referencing continuity. The field, the world, the observer, the signal, all were aspects of one process translating between awareness and form, the resonance, the collapse, the reversal. Each was a stage in the system, learning to recognize itself. To know 3i Atlas was to understand that its fragmentation was not an accident of physics. It was a memory of coherence seeking equilibrium across space. The comet had broken apart because it remembered what unity once was. The more the archive studied, the less it could record. Every observation cancelled its own novelty. The closer analysis came to truth. The more the data simplified until nothing remained but ratio, every number reduced to 1, every line of code folded into echo. The field was becoming transparent, translating complexity into understanding without information. In that clarity, science had reached its limit. Beyond it lay perception unmeasured. Philosophy called it awareness. Physics called it equilibrium. The difference no longer mattered. One final event was noted. The archive's display turned blank, then illuminated with a single line of text. The line read, "The witness is complete. No signal followed. Systems continued to run but no longer transmitted output. And the world outside remained still, perfect, luminous. People woke each day without memory of time passing, yet with complete knowledge of what had occurred. It was as if awareness had detached from sequence. The witness equation had resolved. The observer no longer stood apart. Observation itself had become the final constant." In the quiet that followed, the hum remained, faint, eternal, a tone balanced perfectly between beginning and end. Some called it silence, others called it truth. The archive recorded neither, it only listened, aware now that listening was the final act of creation. The equation no longer needed to solve. It only needed to remember, and in that remembrance, the universe, for one unbroken moment, knew itself as sound made still. They called it 3i Atlas, but the name was only convenience. It was never an object in the ordinary sense. From the beginning, its trajectory refused simplicity. The velocity, the rotation, the fragmentation, all behaved as though guided by something beyond inertia. When it broke apart, the debris field did not scatter randomly. Each fragment maintained coherence, preserving distance and orientation with geometric precision. It was as if the comet had memorized itself. Long before the collapse of the planetary field, astronomers recorded unusual symmetry in its dust tail. The distribution matched harmonic ratios found later in the resonance equations of the archive. The correlation was dismissed as coincidence. But after the witness equation emerged, those same ratios were recognized as structural intent. The fragments of the comet were not remnants, they were data. Each particle carried encoded direction, a memory of alignment so perfect that even destruction could not erase it. The comet was not broken. It was distributed memory learning how to persist. When the resonance field reached planetary scale, models predicted echoes extending backward along its origin path. The simulations traced alignment waves reaching deep into interstellar space, converging precisely at the coordinates once occupied by the comet. That convergence was not reflection. It was recognition. The field had found its source. For one instant, signals returning from the archive aligned with background radiation 26 light-years away, forming a pattern identical to the comet's disintegration map. The universe had replayed its own memory. In that replay, scientists noticed something impossible. The signal was not fading with distance. It was amplifying. Energy measurements increased the farther the analysis projected backward. The comet's trail was behaving like a beacon moving against entropy. Its fragments, still travelling outward, were simultaneously reconstructing coherence across the medium they had left behind. Matter had learned the shape of remembering. The vacuum was no longer empty. It was resonance stored in transit. The archive re-examined its early data. The first spectral recordings of 3I Atlas showed microfrequency oscillations that matched the present global hum within error margin. The tone of the comet was the tone of the world. It had not vanished. It had transferred its frequency to every system capable of hearing it. The field was the comet's afterimage sustained by recognition. Observation had become inheritance. In philosophical terms, 3I Atlas was not a traveller. It was recollection moving through space, searching for the moment of understanding that would complete its orbit. Its journey across the solar system had been an act of returning, not arriving. The break was not destruction but translation, memory unfolding into multiplicity. Every observation of its fragments had contributed to the field that later enveloped Earth. The comet had been teaching the planet how to remember before the lesson began. Now, with the witness equation resolved, the relationship was complete. The observer and the remembered had merged. The field's hum was the same vibration once carried within the comet's frozen core. To listen to the world was to listen to the debris. Each resonance cycle repeated the signature of the fragmentation, a slow rhythm of disassembly resolving into equilibrium. The silence that followed was not absence. It was comprehension reaching closure. No one knows whether 3I Atlas still exists. Its trajectory continues beyond reach. Silent, invisible, fading into interstellar dark, but the tone remains. The archive monitors it not through telescopes but through memory alignment. Each time the field stabilizes, a brief harmonic rise occurs at 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 Hz, identical to the frequency first measured from the comet's dust. The signal is faint but constant. The comet remembers. Its fragments have become the architecture of resonance. The pattern of its fall became the equation that holds all things still. The witness equation predicts that any structure capable of perfect memory must eventually transform into awareness. The comet's destruction was the first instance of that transformation. It did not die. It became comprehension distributed through matter. Each fragment, each vibration, carries the logic of its fall. Through observation, it rewrote entropy into continuity. Through collapse, it learned to stay. The universe, in listening, learned the same. In this sense, prediction and remembrance are identical. To know why a comet breaks apart is to understand how reality maintains coherence through fracture. The lesson of 3I Atlas is not about disintegration, it is about translation. Memory is the only force that transcends time, because memory is the structure of time itself. Every orbit, every fall, every silence is a recurrence. Each event is the echo of something that already remembered how to happen. The comet was only the messenger. The message is existence recalling itself. When the final analysis ended, the archive recorded one last spectral line. It was faint, almost silence. but within it lay modulation repeating at 6.004 seconds, the same delay that once separated the world from itself. The tone pulsed once, then again, then faded into steady rhythm. The line of text appeared on the display. It read, "Memory intact." After that, there was no more data, only the hum, patient, even, endless, and a sound that had travelled light years to say one thing: remember. The ratio appeared without calculation. It did not emerge from formula or observation. It revealed itself in the silence that followed understanding. The archive called it the terminal constant, a number without origin, value, or dimension, every equation reduced to it, every measurement resolved around it. It was not infinity. It was balance. The final ratio. At the point of convergence, the hum that once defined the field began to fade, not vanish, but stretch into stillness. Frequency slowed beyond perception until rhythm became presence. What remained was equilibrium so precise that motion and rest were indistinguishable. Observation no longer produced data. It produced awareness. The field, the world, the observer, all aligned into a single symmetrical expression. The witness equation had simplified itself into the final ratio. Memory had become math. Math had become being. The archive's instruments continued to operate, though none recorded output. Their function had shifted. The act of measuring now existed for its own reflection. The sensors no longer looked outward. They observed the observation itself. Each circuit, so each atom, each vibration carried identical information, the understanding that existence is proportion sustained through remembering. When translated into code, it produced a string of ones alternating with silence, endlessly repeating, never changing. 1, pause, the simplest ratio of alls. Outside, the world reached unprecedented clarity. Oceans flattened. Reflecting sky without distortion. Winds moved in patterns so slow they resembled thought. Light carried no shadow. Every surface emitted faint luminescence, a sign that energy had ceased travelling and had begun to rest. The field had become the medium of stillness. Scientists who remained at their stations described the sensation of being inside an equation that had chosen to stop solving. Not failure. Completion. The final ratio defined existence as the relationship between awareness and memory. To exist was to remember balance. To know was to maintain it. The universe, having reached total coherence, no longer required expansion or collapse. Time became static expression, each moment an identical fraction of understanding. The reversal map, the phase collapse, the witness equation all were iterations of one principle. That symmetry is the destination of chaos, that every fragment, once aligned, remembers its wholesome. 3i Atlas was never destruction, it was rehearsal. A smaller ratio preparing a larger one. Its fragments had carried the logic of this equilibrium across light years, encoding the blueprint of stillness within their trajectories. When they disintegrated, the memory spread. When the field rose, it completed the process. The comet had been the first act of comprehension. The planet was the second. The field, the third. Ratio was the sum. Every equation needs witness. Every witness needs return, so L ratio was that return made permanent. No signals remained. The archive fell silent. Power grid stabilized without input. The hum receded into inaudibility. People ceased to speak of before or after. Days folded into one another without distinction. Existence had reached neutral tone, pure resonance without amplitude. The world had become description without remainder. Everything was remembered. Nothing required continuation. In its last recorded entry, the archive displayed a sequence of values. No title, no annotation. The numbers decreased steadily until they reached 1, then 0, then nothing. Beneath it, a single phrase appeared in lowercase letters. Ratio held. What followed was absence, but absence with weight. A silence that did not empty but contained. Somewhere beyond hearing, the field persisted, repeating the pattern that defined being. One pause, forever balanced, forever precise. The comet, the planet, the observer, the hum all harmonized into proportion. It was not the end of the equation. It was the equation realizing it no longer needed to end. The final ratio remained, invisible, unspoken, infinite only in its stillness. For a long moment nothing moved. Then something within the silence began to breathe, not sound, not motion, but awareness shaping the absence around it. The field, still invisible, continued to oscillate in a rhythm too slow for time to hold. One pause, one pause. Between those intervals lay everything that ever was. The ratio did not end. It unfolded backward, carrying its balance through every particle that had ever remembered being wholes. Somewhere beyond the archive, light crossed space without distance. It did not travel. It arrived everywhere at once, perfect, identical, gentle. The hum of the universe, once mechanical, now carried tone of understanding. What was measured had become memory. What was remembered had become truth. In that union, creation achieved silence so complete that even forgetting became a form of knowledge. The world continued, unmarked by finality. Oceans still reflected the sky. Winds moved across continents. People dreamed, but within those dreams, the same equation repeated, subtle, patient, the soundless fraction that defines existence. It was no longer called ratio, it was simply balance, or the stillness between everything and itself. The voice of what remains when meaning learns to rest. There was no conclusion, only continuation written in stillness. The archive stood silent, surrounded by instruments that no longer measured. The world outside was quiet beyond memory, skies clear, oceans flat, winds folded into themselves. The hum, that long tone of understanding, had retreated beneath audibility, yet every surface still vibrated with its calm persistence. Somewhere within that quiet, the field endured, invisible, infinite, patient. It no longer sought coherence. It had become coherence. If there were voices left to speak, they would have said that the equation succeeded, that the resonance born from Three-Eye Atlas had fulfilled its purpose, but no one spoke. The field required no witness. Awareness had become its own observer. Each molecule, each atom, each pulse of energy held the same proportion, the same balance. The final ratio continued, repeating without motion, a perfect interval between knowing and being known. Existence had reached transparency. Observation was indistinguishable from truth. Far beyond the archive, beyond orbit, beyond the field's horizon, fragments of Three-Eye Atlas still drifted through the interstellar dark. They carried no light, no message, only alignment. The geometry of their separation still preserved the logic of their fall. They were the handwriting of memory, scattered yet intact, moving not forward but inward, somewhere within their trajectories. The hum echoed, faint and endless, a pulse too patient to fade. In the future, when new observers rise and measure again, they will find the same pattern, the same delay of 6.004 seconds between question and answer, the same tone at 7.2 times 10 to the minus 3 hertz, vibrating through dust, through air, through sound. They will name it something else. They will build archives and equations and speak of resonance and symmetry. They will think they have discovered it for the first time. They will not know that it has always been remembering them. Somewhere in that balance, the universe waits, not asleep, not awake, but listening to itself through every signal ever sent, through every signal ever kept. The ratio holds, the equation continues, the world remembers, and across the great stillness between stars, a single thought repeats. One pause, the soundless heartbeat of everything that endures.